thoughts about what we do and what we don't do. And he, as most of you know, he's a professor at Trent University. And he is, he is famous for writing a number of books in the field of gerontology. What's your latest one is on culture?
It's called Cultural Aging.
Cultural Aging.
Getting a little long in the tooth.
Could you say that again, please?
Cultural Aging.
Cultural Aging. And he speaks to cultures of aging, correct? Mm-hmm. Anyway, again, we weren't able to get him last year, but this year we're very fortunate to have him with us. And I think you're going to talk maybe about falls?
I think so.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Try to.
So let's welcome Steve.
Thank you. Thanks for also attending on just prior to a long weekend, which I'm sure you're all looking forward to. This presentation is about aging and falling bodies. I want to start with a short story. A few years ago at a gerontology conference, I don't know if any of you have been to gerontology conferences, there's good and bad aspects to them. I attended a panel on falling. There were papers on measuring posture and gait, and step, and the size of people's feet. There was other papers on fall prevention and intervention, and there was one on experimental research with older individuals on a treadmill who were strapped to a machine, which just as they were about to trip and fall, the machine lifted them up into midair and saved them from falling while terrifying them at the same time. Some lively discussion followed until I asked the mischievous question of what criteria defines a fall. Is it just somebody who falls, or somebody who might fall, or somebody who has fallen? And if they have fallen, how many times have they fallen? One speaker claimed a faller is defined by at least one fall in a 6-month period. Another speaker said if no falls happen within a year after a fall, then the person is no longer considered at risk of falling. A third person said it depended on the injury sustained, but otherwise she didn't know the answer. So I became rather curious about the fact that the faller, the subject of falling, which is the most crucial gerontological issue, is so poorly defined and in fact rather neglected. In this talk then, I want to discuss with you or explore what the sociology of the aging body might bring to the conversation about falls and falling and fallers, and generally what it might bring to gerontological theory. Joseph Sheldon, who's the British geriatrician, whose survey, The Social Medicine of Old Age, was published in 1948, was a leading reference for identifying the features of normal population aging in Britain. He was also one of the first physicians to recognize the problem of falling. In his paper on the natural history of falls in old age, 1960, this is probably one of the first professional papers on aging and falling, Sheldon categorized 500 falls experienced by 200 people, primarily into accidental falls, followed by what he called drop attacks, that is falling without warning, trips, and vertigo. Some falls, he said, happen for unknown reasons. And while Sheldon offered medical explanations where possible, what struck me when I was reading this is his attention to his subject's experience, to the experience of the people who actually fell, including their challenges to get back on their feet after falling. He said they understand their falls as part of a kind of negotiation with gravity. And thus, he says, and I quote, they complain bitterly of the inability to preserve their balance as they did when they were younger. Environments, including stairs, illumination, lighting, slippery surfaces, other obstacles, matter as much as physical stability. And in the end, Sheldon, as a curious statement, which I've put on the overhead, he said, falling in old age is fascinating because at this stage of life, nature resembles the engineer who may release the unexpected. So falling very much has an unexpected, environmental, indeterminate kind of relationship with the people who fell. And that's their interpretation to him as well. After Sheldon, fall research developed slowly, perhaps because fallers were not yet problematized as clients of expertise. Falling itself was still considered kind of incidental, often an inexplicable dimension of aging in everyday life. And also as mainstream gerontology itself developed, medical and residential and even moral boundaries between dependence and independence started to come to the fore. Naturally, older people would come to then fear falling as a kind of stigmatizing transition in status and a kind of affront to their sense of resilience as well. For these reasons, researchers discovered that falls could be trivialized, underreported, or underplayed by older individuals, even though fall research consistently neglected actually to take their stories into account. Nor did they acknowledge the unexpected, that phenomenological realm that Sheldon had first identified. Newell et al., an article I have in my paper, comment that while everyday minor problems might be understood as exacerbated in old age, the converse may also be said for some major problems. I think that's an interesting kind of statement. Minor problems are sometimes blown up and out of proportion, and at the same time, major problems are often trivialized. And I think this statement's relevant to the relationship between fall research and prevention and faller experience. Because while falls have become a major issue, a major global issue, I'll talk about in a moment, they are also trivialized, possibly at the level of embodied experience, at the very level of embodied experience of the people who actually fall. That becomes trivialized. So falls form in this paper a kind of intersection point between the inside and the outside of aging, which makes them, I think, a very good opportunity to review the research and professional discourses on old age itself and the aging body. No, that's not right. So I'm interested in going backwards. Sounds fun. Right. Staying here for a moment. There's lots of literature, professional literature, that portrays falls as a major problem. Rising injuries, hospitalizations, deaths from falling, deaths from the injuries of falling. Just some statistics I've listed here, there's many, many more. In America, between 45% and 61% of nursing home residents fall each year, resulting in significant cases of hip fractures. The mortality rates in the year following the hip fracture are also estimated at between 14 and 35%. In Canada, falls are a major cause of injury, a major reason for entering care facilities, a factor in morbidity, and certainly a growing expense to the healthcare system. Falls are the second leading cause of hospitalization in Canada for women 65 years and older, and the fifth leading cause of hospitalization for men in this age range. It's estimated the direct healthcare costs of falls in Canada are $2.5 billion. In Britain, 50% of older residents in hospitals and care homes fall at least once a year. And hip fractures result in more hospital admissions than any other type of injury. For community dwellers, 65 years and older, the fall rate is 30%. For those 80 years and older, the fall rate is 40%. Other studies have looked at discharged patients from hospitals and find that they fall more than people in the community. There's lots and lots of material painting a very frightening statistical diagram, a map of the costs the injuries is suffering of falls. Some of this has been tabulated and summarized by the World Health Organization in 2007 in their global report on falls prevention in old age. And the WHO report estimates that between 28% to 35% of people 65 years and older fall each year. And of course, the fall rate in cases of injury increases with age. Now, while this statistical picture leaves little doubt that there's a kind of healthcare disaster in the making, whether rhetorical or real, but something in between the two is certainly taking place, what is still typically missing from a lot of this literature is the person who falls and the body that falls. Despite the fact that there are now over 400 risk factors that are assumed to be related to falling, and the risk factors keep growing and growing. For those individuals who do fall and are subject to one or more of these risk factors, we have to understand that their bodies not only fall down, but they also fall out of the social spheres, status spaces, functional spaces of certainty and mobility and utility. In that terrible moment of a hard, unintentional fall comes tumbling to the fore our culture's ambivalence about aging itself, and certainly about the aging body as one that lacks control, that cannot stay up, that fails to hold on, that slips beneath the spaces of utility that most of us are used to by being upright, and falls into a sub-area that often is considered an immediate transition to old age. The failure to resist gravity, both as an outside force and as a bodily center, because the center of gravity is reported to shift as we age, so we have a kind of connection to our phenomenological world through gravity. It's not just the shifting in us, it's a relation between that shift and outside gravity forces as well. The failure to resist gravity, while acceptable in many other circumstances at other ages, everybody falls. Anybody who's played hockey or skated or skied or had children, we've all been children, of course, we probably could fill the next weekend with stories of how many times we fell and hurt ourselves. Nonetheless, in old age, when it happens, it is a special event. It's a transitory event in the sense that it moves the person into other spaces. So falling is not an isolated event. It's a phenomenological process that transforms a person into a faller, into a type of risky body, and mobilizes really a point of entry for them into multiple professional worlds. Worlds of care, worlds of risk, worlds of assessment and prevention programs, hospital and community centers, insurance and medical planning, various other kinds of costs and bureaucratic relations to figure out, and usually the cascade of references between doctor and specialist and next appointment and next x-ray, etc., etc. This is quite a world if a person has not been mobilized into that. The fact of that 5-minute fall is an incredible entry point into a kind of multiple worlds, into multiple worlds beyond the fall itself. So as the overhead tries to summarize, these are some of the things I think are missing in the rather frightening statistical diagram or picture of falls and injuries. The person who falls and the interpretation, their interpretation of what it feels like to fall, their phenomenological understanding of inner and outer gravity. That a fall down is also a fall out of certain spaces, and at the same time it's a fall into other spaces, other multiple and professional worlds. So while it appears that fallers fall, in the end it's the fall that creates the faller. Even though their bodies and the inventory of risks that are embedded in assessments make it seem as if they are a falling person. They are a type of person who falls at the same time. So we have to, it's not just labeling, it's an embodied it's an embodied sort of categorization embedded in them as a kind of risky person, as a kind of faller. I'll talk about how that, what that means in the end. So again, my question that I began the talk with is what is a fall and who falls? Who is a faller? The World Health Organization Global Report states the following, that a fall is inadvertently coming to rest on the ground, floor, or other lower level, excluding intentional change in position to rest in furniture, wall, or other objects. So that could mean a lot of things. Such an operational definition is needed, however, the report says, because otherwise research would leave room for interpretation to study participants. And this results in many different definitions of falls, right? Because they're taking broad interpretations, suddenly the definition of fall, the horizon of possibilities, expands. For example, the report says older people tend to describe a fall as a loss of balance, whereas healthcare professionals generally refer to events leading to injuries and ill health. So it's a nice way of encapsulating a certain gap there, what people experience and interpret as falls and what professionals generally look for in falls. And yet, as Joseph Sheldon had illustrated back in 1960, many different definitions of falls are an advantage to understanding the fall experience, as is the role of personal interpretation and narrative about fall. Loss of balance, and for those of you who have fallen, we all have all our lives, loss of balance along with trips and slips and bumps are primary reasons we all cite for falling. It was just there. There was a bump in the sidewalk. That crack appeared. I don't know where that tree came from, right? It was icier than I thought. I should have checked my shoes. We have lots of ways of interpreting how we fall. We don't just say, well, I'm now 80, so I guess I'm going to be falling. Might as well get used to it, right? That's what a fall feels like in an embodied phenomenological sense. However, these interpretations, these feelings where gravity overwhelms in unexpected ways and uncertain places can become trivialized. Again, we go back to that idea that certain things are trivialized while other things are exaggerated. They can become trivialized within a global and static risk model of the aging body, a problem that is also often hidden in fall prevention programs. I want to talk a little bit about fall prevention and fall prevention programs, and also leave lots of, I hope, time for conversation and questions, and your learning about your experiences and research too. Given the scope of the financial and human costs of falls, fall prevention really is quite a sizable field in its own right. It ties together a number of things. It ties together the governance of health, it ties together research on falls, it ties together forms of care, community care, professional care, and it also ties all those together with kind of micro-sociological concerns about lifestyle, behavior, environment, and intervention. If you're familiar with the fall prevention literature, there's a lengthy list of what's called multifactorial. And what this means, me against the computer. Postpone. Yeah. Ouch. We'll postpone you for 4 hours. See how you like that. Sit on that. I like also how computers are very nice and friendly when you first get them, the voices. Would you like to, have coffee with that decision? Or would you like to go to a spa after downloading that software? It's all soft and everything. Then you make one little mistake and suddenly the computer isn't so nice anymore. It's like, I don't know if you know this, but you've just, and it's kind of still okay. And then you really make a mistake and it's, the gloves are off. You are an idiot. I am taking all your data and you're never ever going to see it again. You are computer stupid. You don't deserve to have a computer. I'm shutting you down now, right? And then those blue screens of death, which are so horrid. There's no nice fonts anymore, no coffee, no spas. It's just bang, right? So we're still, I think, at the nice stage with this. Fall prevention then ties together a lengthy list of multifactorial causes. There's medications that could cause falls, too many medications. As you know, many seniors are on 5 to 12 medications on average. The interaction between those medications is often not well understood. They can cause dizziness at different times, or if food isn't taken at the right time, or the medication isn't taken at the right time, one could become dizzy. There's unsafe environments, there's ice, there's poor lighting, there's slippery bathrooms, there's vision limitations, there's psychological states such as the fear of falling, which paradoxically can actually cause more falls. To counter some of these problems, prevention programs work through the promotion of healthy choices for individuals, usually to change their behavior around such things as exercise, diet, lifestyle, control of their medications, especially for women who have been targeted because it's assumed they're challenged by muscle and bone density decline following menopause. And also adaptation of supportive home modifications as well. There's also a huge advice industry, interestingly enough, growing around falls with popular titles such as, I just quoted a few, The Complete Guide to Fall Prevention, How to Prevent Falls, Better Balance, Independence, and Energy in 6 Simple Steps. Fall prevention, don't let your house kick you out. And lots of other, a whole paper could be written, I think, just on the advice literature on fall prevention. It's interesting kinds of discourses. But how do you figure out who really needs fall prevention? The epidemiological risk of falling for a person 65 years or older supposedly rises to 1 fall per year. Then, according to one article on fall prevention, the best approach to preventing falls in any group of older persons requires knowledge of where that group sits on the risk spectrum, because this will determine the type and amount of services required as well as the program effectiveness. Well, I've listed some aspects here of fall prevention and also some of the problems with fall prevention. There are several, and these are just some of them. First, some analyses have shown that the costs of fall prevention services are not always knowable, and in some instances can even cost more than they save. And that's a quote from the fall prevention article. They can cost more than they save. Second, some fall prevention aims at lifestyle risks, whatever that may mean. But not all lifestyle risks of falling are actual risks or causes of falls. So that huge inventory of 400 risk factors doesn't mean that all of those factors actually cause falls. They're risks of falling, but the research on whether they cause falls and falling or not is often indeterminate or under-researched. Yet the inventory grows and grows. Third, the coordination of fall evaluations such as home inspection expertise designed to assess risks is complex and often not standardized. You can get very different kinds of assessments of your home environment from different sources that don't coordinate. Even individual choices about installing assistive devices or risk preventive devices, which are good ideas, grab bars in bathrooms, non-slip surfaces, easy to reach faucets, all of these evoke larger issues of social support and affordable, age-friendly housing. Did the light just go off here?
It's just your screen.
Hmm?
The screen's doing the same thing,
Oh,
but your lights look good to us.
oh, good, all right, thank you for that. We're not, you and I don't have a good relationship, do we? We're gonna talk later. For instance, in Canada, 10 to 15% of falls at home happen in bathrooms. Bathrooms are very dangerous and risky places, but there are fewer bathtub grab bars installed in privately owned than publicly owned buildings. And 1/3 of Canadian seniors live in apartment buildings. So this becomes a political issue. If there's no regulation, really, or oversight about privately owned buildings, where many older people live, what kinds of grab bars are being installed, if any? Fourth, the risks of institutional environments, hospitals and care facilities that contribute to falls can also be underplayed. For instance, in hospitals and care institutions, older patients frequently fall in their rooms and in the hallways and in the bathrooms, due in part, according to one study, to staff shortages or lack of training. People who are taking care of them are not trained to worry about falls. And at the same time, the people often underreport falls because they want to get out of the hospital, too. So institutional settings may actually contribute to underreporting, since falls have few witnesses, staff are often not trained, and data becomes of questionable quality due to staff time pressures. They don't often have time to write full reports, full enough reports on people falling in hospitals, especially this button. But the central problem with fall prevention is the lack of participation by older people themselves. Interesting that we have this sizable field, we have, with all good intentions, lots of professionals very keen to prevent falls, but then there's the people themselves who need to participate in such programs. Again, at this gerontology conference, there's at least 2 or 3 panels just on this problem alone. How can we get people to participate? Why are people not participating? Why don't they want our help? When consulted about their views on fall prevention programs, in one study, older people think that falls are less important than other health factors. That sometimes isn't appreciated. Sometimes people have multiple health factors or problems, and falls don't necessarily rise to the top of that list, although they do for the fall prevention program itself. In an Australian study of post-discharge fall prevention for older individuals, the authors discovered that, in their words, program designers had little knowledge about older people's views about falls and their perceptions of barriers that prevented engagement with risk-reducing behaviors. Further, in the research literature, the same study says no studies have evaluated older people's knowledge or self-efficacy about falls and fall prevention strategies in the post-discharge period. So they're discharged, but there's not much done afterwards in terms of fall, despite the fact, here's another quote, that suggested strategies by the people themselves, such as being careful, moving slowly, or avoiding hazards, did not appear to be supported by the research evidence, which I find kind of puzzling. Those seem like fairly commonplace and certainly reasonable kinds of strategies, but they were not supported by the research evidence. When older people...
What sort of evidence?
Pardon?
What
Well,
sort of evidence?
evidence based on risk factors, injuries, that area. Fall research evidence. It's pretty hard to research being careful.
Exactly.
What's being too careful? Are they careful enough? Are they sort of careful, you know? Are they slightly
Exactly.
careful? Moving slowly would be really hard to research, I would think. You know, how slow is slow, right? And when does moving slowly prevent falls? When doesn't it prevent falls? And avoiding hazards, which we all do, and makes perfect sense, again, would be difficult to put in, you know, because these are, again, phenomenological kinds of subjective dimensions of fall prevention. And good ones, too. I mean, they all make a lot of sense. When older people are consulted about their own fall prevention practices, they are aware of the relationship between their aging bodies and the material environments they live in. For example, a study of individuals 80 years and older who had fallen in Finland highlights how creative home-based body strengthening exercises and protective furniture arrangements were used. It was a really good ethnographic study that went into people's homes and saw very creative, innovative ways in which they designed their own environments. Especially strategically placed cushions were used to control the risks of falling. Cushions in various places that were the people themselves determined were possible areas of fall. It's got a great title. That article is called Indispensable Chairs and Comforting Cushions. falls and the meaning of falls in 6 older persons' lives. That's the Journal of Aging Studies, in 2010. It's Mahler, M-A-H-L-E-R. First initial is M. 2010, volume 24. So when older people are judged to be at risk of falling, of course their participation in a fall prevention program is important, but can also, again, be a stigmatizing at-risk label. Such stigmatization can actually amplify the fear of falling, and paradoxically, people start to resist healthy and fall-preventing physical activities, the research has shown too, because they're afraid of injuring themselves. Certainly the unappealing advice given to women that they wear unattractive hip padding or special shoes can only add to the visibility of that label. I don't think that should be a surprise to the researcher, that looking larger and more padded would not be an attractive thing to do and to go out in public, even though you would possibly fall and bounce back up or be padded.
How about airbags?
Airbags. That could do it.
Inflate on him.
You know, it's interesting how we support padding in athletic arenas, how we make it attractive and sexy. We also have wheelchairs where the wheels go like that, in Olympic basketball sport. You know, we do have a lot of assisted and protective clothing devices in our athletic worlds that we never question really as unattractive. And yet when it comes to older people, for some reason, the assistive devices, the wheelchairs often, the padded, you know, the padding is unappealing, is not sexy, is not sporty, in other words, because falling, of course, isn't a sport. But there's no reason why we can't kind of...
It's part of the sport.
It's part of the sport, yeah. But there's no reason why we can't get on the design front a little better with some of that stuff, too. And falls are embarrassing. You know, they're embarrassingly publicized and become part of one's biography. Oh, she fell. That's all you need to say, right? So fall prevention, when it centers on the measurement of risk factors to the exclusion of a person's responses to falling and narratives of experience and own home ingenuity, often or environmental ingenuity about preventing falling, creates a conflict between a self-understanding of embodied life and an at-risk embedding evidence-based assessment of that life. So it's not surprising that really positive programs that stress maintaining independence, weight reduction, having fun, taking some risks, building strength with confidence, and above all, not being judged by age, are the most successful programs. Finally, gender rarely figures into fall professional discourse, except where it notes that women fall more often, take more medications, and suffer more injuries than men. The patronizing double image that both naturalizes women as physically weaker and more risk-prone, especially after menopause. Apparently you become a different species after menopause. And also reviles feminine strength and risk-taking as unfeminine. Encourages older women to see their own bodies as vulnerable. There was a really interesting study done in Denmark of women who finally got to see their own X-rays of their own bone density. Pardon? Yes, you know, that it's really curious in terms of a self-reflection on their own sense of strength, because the X-rays made them feel that their bodies were at risk, even though they weren't necessarily. But the way they were presented to them, in fact, you know, when we all see our own X-rays, there's something rather self-reflexively frightening about it. That's us inside, right? That's the part we can't see, but that's in us. And that could slip, and that could break, and that looks a little warped, and that looks a little cracked, and, you know, I thought my pelvis was a little nicer than that, you know. It's a pretty ugly pelvis in there I have to live with, you know. It really changes our sense of our bodies, I think, seeing X-rays. Women are often also given, as I say, a higher number of medications, which can cause dizziness and loss of stability. A British study also found In cases of injury recovery at home after a fall, female carers who were caring for someone who fallen, male or female, often encouraged more self-esteem or autonomy and reasonable risk-taking, while male carers who cared for female people who fell practiced more protective styles, sometimes even coercive caring styles. So there is that issue too of how are female fallers and male fallers actually treated, both at home and sometimes in institutional settings as well. So gendered relations of power can become concentrated in the treatment of women fallers whose older bodies may already have been subjected to various forms of stereotyping anyway. Excuse me. Some of this vodka here.
Yeah, it is.
This is the last part I want to discuss today, which has to do with the sociology of the falling body, expanding this discussion out a little bit theoretically. And the question I've been asking in this paper is, how does fall research figure into the wider discussion about the sociology of the aging body? After all, the relationship between the human body and the phenomenology of falling lies at the core, really, of our human evolutionary development as bipedal hominids. This is a statement I kind of like from Garrett Sodden. He's written a terrific book called Defying Gravity. And he says, we as humans have a challenge to consciously control falling and staying upright. And that's meant that playing with gravity may provide the most intense examples of the flow phenomena, of primates flowing in their environment, trees especially. I mean, think of going to the zoo and watching gibbons up there in the trees, defying gravity, flying around up there at amazing speeds, right? Or other arboreal monkeys. Because gravity is the constant and unyielding force in which we evolved. It unfailingly arouses our primal brain. It lets us reliably slip in and out of our protective frame without the vagaries of a human opponent. And it unequivocally focuses all our attention on the here and the now. Sodden's argument is that our very brain development as hominids is linked to our negotiation with gravity in evolution, as is our whole bipedal development, standing upright and trying to stay upright over the last couple of 100,000 years. The human ingenuity investing in overcoming gravity is also a long-standing cultural enterprise. It's not just today's research discovery to do with aging and falls. The first human parachute jump was from a hot air balloon you might be interested in by a Parisian in 1797. A huge crowd gathered in Paris to see this man, André Jacques Garnerin, jump from a hot air balloon and nearly kill himself in a parachute. The flying trapeze acrobatics, Jules Leotard, where we got the word leotard from. And wire walkers over Niagara Falls, a whole history of them in the 19th century. Wire walking over Niagara Falls. To all the surfers and roller coasters, the mountaineers of the early 20th century, when the Alps were opened up, where they built some of the first, when the first train tracks were built to give people access to the Alps, created a mountaineering frenzy. A lot of injuries, a lot of falls. And finally to today's bizarre culture of extreme sports with all manners of boards and bikes and skis and skates flying through the air. Right? We're obviously a gravity-obsessed species. Negotiating it, defying it, dealing with it, and enjoying it. Indeed, again, the making of our very biological and social bodies could only happen through risk-taking and playing with gravity, because these are the ways that we explore our environments. These are the ways that we animate our competence as human bodies. Walking, shopping, wandering, dancing, gardening, playing might all involve some level of risk of falling, But an exclusive focus on preventing falls may also cut the health benefits of such activities. In this regard, a British study on a day facility in Britain finds that the focus on physical activity and risk and the staff's role in limiting what they call inappropriate patient behavior reinforce passivity amongst the service users to their own detriment. If we expect older people to be responsible self-carers, then we have to respect the risk-taking and experimentation that comes with the adjustment staging as well. These include a better sense of how the phenomenology of gravity as a fluid and nomadic experience links to reasonable risk-taking and risk prevention as kind of embodied skills, embodied knowledge. We also need to think about the connection between walking, staying upright, and falling as a connection, not as things to be divorced from each other. For example, in the community, professional definitions of walking and falling can be very narrow and exclusive and assume that walkable environments are also accessible, safe, and risk-averse. However, in parallel to fall studies, there are walkability research studies that some of you may be aware of. And walkability studies also sidelines the experiences of people and perceptions of residents by simply focusing on environments. Like pedestrian-friendly streets will therefore make everybody pedestrian-friendly and be friendly to all pedestrians. But different bodies, of course, different forms of mobility are also measured against active, able-bodied, standard humans who walk in unaided and unencumbered ways. They're the standard. So the research, according to one study of walkability research, says the research reduces the challenges faced by disabled people to a dilemma of access, rather than addressing the significant embodied experiences and emotions of being out of place in disabling city environments shaped by other forces. In other words, for older people at risk of falling, walking is not simply exercise in a pedestrian-friendly environment. It's a relay of challenges filled with hard surfaces, unexpected obstacles, speeding vehicles, and sometimes dizzying social spaces. Sometimes it's a triumph. It's a success to walk and not injure oneself. So how would urban design, community planning, and fall prevention programs be different if older people were better consulted? Or if their embodied experience were better understood? While we cannot trust our bodies not to fall, neither can we understand or prevent falls without including the phenomenological, environmental, and material relationships between body, person, and experience. This critical call links the sociology of the falling body with current work on embodied aging, advanced by cultural gerontologists like Tony Calasanti in the United States, Julia Twigg in Britain, Emmanuel Toole in Scotland, who all write about physical aging being inseparable from lived material contexts. For instance, Julia Twigg's got a wonderful book called Bathing, some of you may know about. And her research on bathing and care work in Britain demonstrates that even something as microsociological, as sometimes trivialized as a bath, becomes a kind of embodied microcosm where touch and sensation and vulnerability all get animated between the care recipient and the caregiver. In a 15-minute bath, one can observe an enormous cultural ambivalence about aging bodies and experiences, which is why she starts with the bath and expands from there to everything else. One could have a book called The Grab Bar. It would do the same job. Start with the grab bar and move out, into more and more macro social dimensions. Her recent work, by the way, is on clothing, which is really interesting, aging in clothing, where not a lot has been done either. How the elasticity of our bodies and the elasticity of fashion design clothing for older people seem to grow together. So that growing older is mediated through the clothes we wear. the bathing experiences we have, the ways in which our bodies interact with professional care. Manuel Toole writes about runners and older runners and their practices and routines and environments and their injuries and their faults. Fascinating work. Manuel Toole, T-U-L-L-E. There's other work on dancers, on aging dancers, that show the intimate ways in which the aging body is negotiated through style and performance and the maintenance of injury-free, hopefully the maintenance of injured bodies. And some of you are more aware perhaps of the research on dementia, phenomenology, embodied experience, person-centered care, etc. Pia Contos in Toronto is one such researcher working on that. You may know her. That also talks about this inseparability between physical and material reality. So to conclude, I think these inquiries constitute what might be called a field of the materiality of embodied aging. A mouthful, but you know, why not? And the materiality of embodied aging casts the materiality of aging, the environmental and material conditions of aging, into a perspective that both includes the physical experiences of aging, doesn't neglect the body, and the lived experiences of older people themselves. In particular, this kind of field challenges two tendencies we find in gerontological theory. One is a biologization of the body, a leaving of the body to the medical or the sciences. After all, they do bodies, leave it to them. Especially a biologization of the older body, or what is called the fourth age in Britain, against overly successful, positive, successful models of third age bodies. A second kind of tendency in the gerontological literature is to overly social construct. Everything is so socially constructed that the physical and material realities of embodied life are also often ignored, paradoxically. In other words, the struggle against essentialism in the social sciences, naturalism, etc., has often left the body out of the picture also. And again, up to the sciences to determine primary models for us. The materiality of embodied aging, that I think is supported by people like Pia Contos and Julia Twigg and Emmanuel Toole, focuses on the material conditions of bodily life against both overly biologizing models and overly socially constructivizing models, if that makes sense. Too much left and too much right. And also takes into account, again, people's own narratives and understandings of their own bodies. So in the end, the issue of falls and the materiality of embodied aging converge as a kind of meeting point, a kind of nexus point. There's the physical, there's the biographical, there's the phenomenological, and there's the cultural realms that it kind of knits together or introduces a conversation between. Where embodiment becomes the ground to challenge, again, both biological and constructivist reductionism. Let's go back to the person then and subjective experience. An older individual who reaches for a grab bar in a moment to facilitate a bathtub transfer, let's say, on a slippery bathroom floor, as they attempt not to fall, or they attempt to manage the risk of falling, is moving within a kind of microcosmic world of the grab bar, the bathtub, the bathroom, and the residence, negotiating all those kinds of phenomenological sensations in a way, bringing them together in their act and managing them. These elements in turn coalesce, I think, into a very emotionally intimate assemblage of spaces and relationships, tied to the person's sense of resilience, competence, and dependence. And they intersect macro worlds also of health and safety and social support and quality of life. All of this is going on in a kind of phenomenological flow in that very moment of reaching for that grab bar. Just like Julia Twig's subjects slipping out of their robes and into the bath. It's also a moment of negotiation between body and environment, but within an ageist culture obsessed by the fear of loss of control. That underlies the moment as well. Don't lose control. Hold on. Stay up. Don't go down. Where a fall commonly symbolizes a passage into declining old age. Yet the older body that falls or resists falling or is at risk of falling is also a window, a portal from which to view the contingent nature of the aging process itself and the ways in which biography and culture and biology are kind of knitted together. So just as the embodiment of aging has a subjective dimension, as I've been arguing, the subjectivity of aging has a physical dimension. And that's materialized in activities and environments and social systems in which we grow older, all of us at every stage of life, and find meaning, even in those spaces that are disregarded or trivialized because bodies fall and drop out of them. So in these ways, I think falls provide a multidisciplinary opportunity for all of us. Students, researchers, teachers, practitioners, all of us in the sciences, the professions, the social sciences and the humanities, they should not be limited to fall research and risk factors alone. Falls allow us to advance our critical and our caring perspectives on the aging body and the human spirit as well. And so from that first conference, as I mentioned, where professionals were struggling, I thought, to define what a fall means, I've become really interested in what it means as well to research and to the sociology of the body. A last comment, I was in France about 3 years ago. It was night, a beautiful little location in the countryside. I went up on a hill to get laundry that had been drying without realizing there was a ditch behind me. I turned around in the dark, started to fall, and to prevent my fall, I rotated on my knee, which ripped out one of the ligaments, I think the MCL it's called, and fell into a bunch of thorns, which I also am allergic to. So,
It's only funny because you survived.
yeah. And so I'm laying there, and my wife was inside in the house enjoying several glasses of wine, oblivious to this terrifying experience outside. And I was just laying there looking up at the stars as swelling began, my knee of course, but the rest of me too because of the thorns, and slowly crawled my way up and crawled into the house. And it was really very interesting to fall, to be down, to see the world from down there, and to try and crawl out of down there back into the light, back into the spaces that we value as the status spaces, the spaces in which we hold on and stay up. So there is a bit of an experiential dimension to this study from myself as well. Anyway, I've been talking for a while, so I think I'll stop here. And do we have time for some comments or questions? I'd love to hear what any of you think. Yes, sir.
Since I'm probably the oldest person here, I better ask my question if I remember what it is. Your last observation about being in the dark brought to mind the notion of people who are not living and working in cities with sidewalks and roads and traffic lights and so on and so forth, but say living in the country, historically and currently, or during blackouts and war. I lived on an island once where there was absolutely no light for walking around 60 years ago. Power outages and so on and so forth. Is there any research into the, shall we say, my term, the learning capacity of people who live mainly outside the cities, that perhaps the propriocentric self develops a different capacity to use other sensory data to walk better. But maybe none, but it occurs to me it might be something there.
I'm sure there is. I mean, 99% of our human evolution was in environments like that, after all. There is some cross-cultural anthropological data. There is a new area called the sociology of the senses, and there's even a journal, the sociology of the senses, that is looking at some of these things. Maybe some of you know of research in non-urban, not hyper-lit 24-hour environments, rural areas or country areas.
Gambia.
Gambia?
Some work done on, they were looking particularly at issues around bone mineral density and fracture. And the interesting thing is that although there are falls, although there's low bone mineral density, the fracture rate is much lower, the fracture rate is much lower. So that might speak a little bit to what you're asking about.
I think our bodies adapt too, don't you? I mean, if the lights all went out, you'd start to sort of feel your way around things differently, wouldn't you? And if you got used to that and skilled at that, it would become part of your repertoire of negotiating with your environment, right? I've been to northern Kenya where people climb mountains in flip-flops, basically. Maasai and Samburu people I was with. I'm astonished that they can do this. But they're not just walking, they're almost feeling their way through the pathways, which I have no skill to do, right? Out of the sun, into shadows during the heat. And it's almost like an embodied knowledge, and kind of subconscious knowledge that Merleau-Ponty, philosopher, wrote a lot about this too, that our bodies behave subconsciously. So if there's a rock coming to your head, you duck. There's not part of your brain that goes, I wonder if I should duck. Let me think about it.
Well, you also, you were talking about the sporting attire and the industry that's become, and then think about Zola Budd, the South African runner who ran barefoot in the Olympics.
Oh, right.
And I think that obviously sensation plays a part there. People would tell you that's not possible, it's not good for you, and yet it's possible to get to the Olympics without wearing shoes.
Yeah, right.
I was going to say I'm also one of the older people in the room probably, and may I say up in Georgian Bay at the cottage, now that my husband's retired, we're able to be there 4 weeks or a month at a time, and very small island, non-electrified, kerosene lamps, a few battery-powered LED lights, formerly with a water pump, just a composting toilet, an existing outhouse. One adjusts to a different routine because it's getting dark at a certain time, and but you're right. It becomes a different, somewhat of a different lifestyle. And my husband tries to go barefoot as much as possible, where he wouldn't here. So yes, darkness and lack of light is a major factor. May I say, what you were saying was very interesting about institutions reducing risk, or healthcare providers reducing risk, and a senior themselves, or let's say their family perception of risk. My mother and I, my late mother and I, unfortunately, in her retirement home, had the unfortunate timing of her having what turned out to be an incompetent night shift RPN, who, after my mother somehow in her 2-room apartment fell and fractured pelvis, sometime in the late afternoon before dinner time, the nurse gave her Tylenol, had someone carry her down to dinner and carry her back, where she'd always been able to walk herself. And fortunately, I called my mother at 9 p.m. that night, knew that now she had advancing vascular dementia. So She couldn't say, she definitely was not normal, she definitely was in pain, she couldn't say what her pain was. And so I took a cab immediately, and I had to call the ambulance close to midnight because the nurse just kept saying, it's okay, she's had Tylenol. So this was, and the nurse was ultimately fired and went through the union procedures and all that, and I didn't sue her or anything because I wanted my mother and us out of there as soon as possible. The home still exists, it's been taken over by one of the larger retirement home providers, but it was a case where I had to insist that there was something very, very wrong, and from that, well, before then, but from that point on, I was my mother's advocate, and fortunately went into Kensington Gardens as long-term care after my mother's rehab. She was lucky she didn't have a hip, it was pelvis where you don't need the surgery. Unfortunately, my mother went into Kensington Gardens, which is an excellent,
Yes.
wonderful, caring, wisely designed, well-staffed.
Well, you were fortunate,
Place.
as you say, your mother had you, and now.
But if I
Kensington
had not
Gardens.
called that evening, I have no idea, my mother would have been put to bed.
Yeah, well, exactly.
So it was
And lots of people are.
um,
Lots of people are on the floor for 3 days.
yeah, so.
That's the saddest thing,
um,
isn't it? Come in and find someone.
So, anyway. And
Thank you for that. Good ending to so far.
That's what we all fear, somebody else being in charge of our bodies, even though we.
Well, but
Don't
there
want
are
to be.
many, many wonderful people who are.
Oh,
in very
absolutely.
places.
But-
This happened to be, unfortunately.
In the fall capacity, really, the two things is that increases with age is fear. The fear of actually falling because of the fear of the consequences of the fall and of recuperation and how much that affects your mobility and your mortality. Those factors, and it actually builds up. Every fall increases your awareness that it's not like when you were younger, you just got up and, okay, maybe it's a break and you got a cast on it. There's other things that make you less active, less into exercise, more stressed because of the anticipation of what might happen if I fall, they won't let me come back home. I think that whole fear factor of what all the way that spiral, you say cascade, I think is increasingly negative on the person's
Sure.
and their feeling of in control and having got capacity, much less looking at dementia or any other physiological.
So no, I think we don't politicize it enough either. I mean, on the trivialized side of falls, negligent landlords, ice that's not cleared, lights that are not fixed, carpets that are not put down on slippery floors, rickety railings, no grab bars or substandard grab bars that are in buildings or in baths, floors that could have, easy to reach faucets are, there's all kinds of technical things that are really important, but because that level of fall understanding is so trivialized, it's all exaggerated in the individual, their lifestyle, their choices, their how they walk. Massive studies on posture, on gait, on where you point your toes, etc. Right, and really insufficient pressure on landlords, developers, people who see public spaces as either accessible or disabled. It's either one or the other, and all the great variety and variation of mobility of all different ingenious types in between are basically not even part of what's called walkability studies, as people who are supposed to study these kinds of things. So we keep talking about falls being the problem of the faller, and not about the material conditions enough that's embodied in our lives. I mean, if I leave something on the floor in the hallway, I'll trip over it. That's not because I don't have enough vitamin E. And like, that's because some idiot left their shoes there, you know, I mean, it's if the ice isn't cleared, I'll slip on it, so will we all. It's not because you're necessarily an endangered person, a person at risk because you're old, right? But when a 14-year-old slips on the ice, it's fun. Even though they could get bruised and break something, when a 75-year-old slips on the ice, it's not fun.
It's the consequence of fracture.
Exactly,
For
yeah.
That's what the
Exactly,
bottom line is.
right.
Sorry, is there somebody else in the queue? I was interested in your list. Thank you for not listing all 400 of the risk factors. But one of the, I was once part of a grant writing team, a very large grant writing team we broke up into about bone health. And one area that I was part of was about falls prevention. And one of the other people on the team said, really, the problem is, if you got rid of pets and stairs, you'd be fine. And what really struck me is I could see living well without stairs, but I wonder about living well without pets for some people.
Exactly.
And I've not heard of much research on that, and I'm just
You
thinking,
mean pets that cause falls?
well,
I know cats are
cats and
prime,
dogs, but I think that we
yeah.
didn't get that specific, we moved on to other areas, but it's just something that stuck with me, and I wondered if it's anything that's come up in your area, or just because the benefits, the psychosocial benefits of pets
course,
can be so
yeah.
huge, and yet
Of course.
this was a practitioner saying, get rid of pets, you're much better off in terms of your falls risk.
Really?
And I'm just thinking, what an interesting tension, what an interesting area to conduct research.
That would be.
Anybody has
You
a
know anything about that?
Well, I have a very personal anecdotal thing, that almost every older friend that I have has broken an ankle or a shoulder, having been dragged by their large dog in
Dragged
the
by
last
their
year.
dog. Wow.
Which made it very, it wasn't blips and blaps over 10 years. It's like in the last year, I've had so many people go to the hospital because of this. So that gives me a clue as to where we can look very easily. We can get to emergency room admissions records very easily. Almost all of them are electronically kept. You can find out how many of them are related to an animal. And then you could go to the cat and dog registry and see how many people own these pets. I don't know if you can get the ages of the people who own these pets. But that would be one way to at
Yeah.
least get a ratio of.
I guess I'm not a quantitative person, so I hadn't really thought about it in quantitative. I was thinking much more of a kind of an
But in terms of
ethnographic
what
or
data
something.
are available.
Yes,
that's a way to start.
That's true, that would be a way to
So
start.
you mean they're walking their dogs outside when
You're
this
walking it could be inside, well, generally it's outside because they're on a leash.
Yeah.
The whole problem is a person with a leash, and I was just visiting my mom in LA last week, and this very little old family friend, little Japanese lady, total setup for osteoporosis and hip fracture, had this huge dog. And she said from across the street, "Is that Tiffany?" And I said, "Yes, but wait there, I'll come to you." The dog started running across the
Oh my
street. She
God.
had one of those stretching,
Yeah,
extendable
yeah.
leashes things, and she smartly let go of it.
Mm.
But then the thing went whang towards me. I was going to get hit in the head with
Oh my
the
God.
leash thingy, and I was like, I don't want the dog. Don't want the dog. And the leash thing is
Wow.
swinging around and going wang, wang, and it just looked like a major
Oh my
hazard for
God.
everyone near her. And she had to lean against the brick wall because she didn't have the dog pulling her forward
Yeah.
anymore. And the whole thing was a
The
free-range
dog's
circus.
just too
It
big for
just-
her.
Yeah, but her daughters gave her the dog, so she's not going to get rid of the dog. Yes.
Also, it's
I
one of
just think
those-
it's a very interesting topic, and I thought it might be something.
Well, I know
Maybe
cats.
somebody
I've
else
had
would.
cats all my life, and they'll,
Line
4
one,
o'clock
right?
in the morning when you're going to the bathroom, they'll get right in your way at the chance that you might feed them or stroke them.
Exactly.
They figure there's one way to get your attention, which is to make you fall and break your neck. So, because they can't talk, or anything. So cats, and cats are always dancing around you, and you're going down the stairs. They go one at a time. They come back. They can
Yep.
drive you completely crazy. So I could see tripping. I've tripped over my cat for sure. And if I had multiple cats, that would be, I've had 2
The
cats
cat lady
before.
is totally different from the rest of the population. So
Sort of,
you
although
have to sort that out as an outlier
I
population.
don't know, we have 2 cats and a dog, so we can trip over anything, but I do worry about it when the grandparents come.
Now, things like gerbils and mice, snakes,
Fish are the best.
Fish are the best, because to trip over a fish, you really have to be.
I can tell you a story about
Very
what I
weird.
Anyway, it struck me as a.
Well, there you go, there's a paper.
For somebody.
You know, though, and I'd like to add one other group, besides the emergency department and physicians, are veterinarians, who also hear a lot about this, and who are leaders in their field, and who could have some intelligent say about these whole issues. So, I mean, I can see a
When
ton
I
of
first thought of
research.
this, that's right, I thought of, I had met somebody who was in veterinary school, and I said,
And they're
somebody
really
in vet school
interested.
like
They're
to do
very
this
interested in
research.
aging pets and their aging owners. They are very interested. So there's a whole area right
You know,
there.
that's making me think of the pound or the Humane Society. They will get the animal back if it's not compatible
I know.
with the owner. And maybe that's even closer to the question that you're asking.
Yeah.
There's lots of folks.
I'm kind of asking somebody else to ask the question.
I'm intrigued. I am now going to be going home and looking this up.
Excellent.
I am
Mission
very
accomplished.
intrigued. Yeah, no, this is interesting.
Toronto seems to have a very strong culture of the urban cyclist, and I guess a very good lobby. Is there any research done into the causality, the cause of falls in association with cyclists on the sidewalk? When I shout at them to suggest they might be somewhere else, they don't seem to like it very often. So occasionally they apologize, but that seems to be a very tricky issue, especially someone like me. I have a hearing problem. I have this remote control. So I'm walking in traffic. I tend to turn it off, and to be surprised, and I don't wear a helmet, by a cyclist coming up behind me is quite a challenge. The start factor is there too. So I wonder, have you seen any research that addresses that as a
I
political
haven't
issue?
myself, but you know, Toronto is not very bike friendly. We have people who like to ride and want to ride more, but there's not a lot of places to ride. I have a mayor who doesn't even know what a bicycle is.
With the shorts.
And if he did, God help him if he sat on one, but,
So the other point is there's an existing bylaw in the city of Toronto that prevents adults from being on the sidewalk.
yes, you cannot ride, you are not supposed to ride your bike on the sidewalk at all. It's for people to walk. Of course, if there's nowhere to ride.
Under 24 inches.
Which
Children's
was
bikes are okay.
trying to accommodate youth and children on bicycles.
I mean, if you go to cities like Copenhagen, for instance, or
Yeah.
Helsinki or Amsterdam, which are big bike cities, and have their own bike lanes and their own bike rules, and even little stoplights for bikes, you know, it's a completely different situation. I'm sure the injury rate is just minimal compared to what we have here.
And the liability is entirely on drivers.
Exactly. You have 3 lanes in Copenhagen: walking, cycling, and driving, and they're all equally important. And the number of people who ride to work in these cities, and the number of types of bikes, in a way, the bikes are safer too, because there's children on bikes, there's older people riding bikes, there's 2 people on bikes, there's all kinds of bicycles. While we haven't expanded that technology much here, because there's hardly any place to ride that's safe. You can't ride on a sidewalk. If you ride on a road without a bike lane, of course, you know, your chances of being injured. Plus, our sewer grates are
Next to the
terrible.
streetcar and
It's-
tracks.
Yeah, it's actually unfortunate in Toronto. But I don't know any research myself of bike injuries. Again, kids fall all the time, and it's fine. It's part of growing up. It's part of learning how to ride a bike.
I think there is actually quite a lot of research that people have on Scandinavia.
Yeah, oh,
But
definitely.
I couldn't cite it.
It's wonderful to be in those cities, though, in terms of feeling the mobile flow around you in different kinds of ways. People are walking, streetcars, riding, cycling. A lot, exactly.
And young people.
But you see more older people on bicycles here in the city. I've noticed in the last 15, 20 years, there's more older people on bicycles. Most of them on the road.
But on limited streets, I mean, outside of the downtown core, maybe places where there's bike lanes. I mean, I live in the more towards the suburbs, and it would be a disaster on some of those Finch and Shepherd and Eglinton and, North Young Street and everything. It's terrible. I've tried writing a lot, and almost got killed a couple of times. It's just great,
I guess slightly sort of different question. Going back to the definition of what constitutes called the WHO definition, people are doing sort of healthcare practice, health science research, and they want to consider attitudes and definitions like that. My question's about funding structures, really. You want to lay out a study in which you look at attitudes for rehab rates, attitudes before a fall, attitudes after a fall, family support, which is essentially subjective experience terminology, and yet the World Health Organization is explicit in their discounting that. What does that do to research culture for people who actually want to be more phenomenological and are working from the health sciences? Funding structures like the CIHR are not open. You have to make a really strong qualitative case, and even then. So, I mean, on the one hand, you're advocating a certain kind of research. On the other hand, the funding bodies are not open to that research because international organizations create definitions that sort of buffer their, kind of diversity. So how do we change the research culture definitions to make that kind of phenomenological research something that's
That's
funded?
a very good question, of course. I mean, CIHR and SHRC increasingly wants to know what are the benefits to the subject population. I think if you could demonstrate that there are benefits to the there again
It's
we
hard
go.
when international organizations are saying that obscures the kind of quality of the research is when you have too many definitions.
Correct.
It's a really interesting research culture problem.
Mm-hmm.
You're calling for interdisciplinarity in gerontology, which I think everyone would agree is very important. And yet, there is no way to quantify the value of that interdisciplinarity.
Right.
So how do we begin that kind of critique to make the kind of work that you're calling for work that is funded and work that can be valued, right?
Yeah, and again, the only, one of the ways I could see is expanding our sense of quality of life beyond just an inventory of activities and risk factors and checklists, If you could show that what you're trying to research again, I know it's hard.
Yeah, no, it's just an interesting challenge. Because we critique the biomedical model and the people who are doing, quantitative healthcare research that see the quantitative effect of attitudes. I'm not a quantitative person. I'm not making a case for.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying.
And those people are even
Yeah.
like it's a culture that's stymieing a certain kind of research, right? So I don't know. Just to anyone in the room, I'm not a health science person, but I see that there are people trying to do this in dementia care, for example, dementia care and fracture rehab. Attitudes are a huge factor in successful rehab, and yet definitely.
Well, and then you look at people like Pia Campos, who actually is very successful and very well funded.
Yeah.
So there are avenues, there are ways and means. One way is working within a team approach, which is in some ways quite antithetical to social science research, and yet does seem to be something that gets funded.
The new restructuring of CIHR grant applications may be exactly the opportunity that you're looking for. Again, you'd be part of a team that's providing a particular intervention, and there's all these efficacy measures, and that's sort of going to be the heart of the budget.
But their definition of knowledge transfer is still really.
That's exactly it. So then you're going to have the knowledge translation piece, because each of these grants will still have the 5 criteria that they're looking for, one of which is how are you going to translate this knowledge or disseminate it? And that's the piece where you get in, put in the budget. They like multidisciplinary things. So the whole team grant idea is supposed to foster exactly the deficit that you're mentioning. I'm hoping that.
Well, I'm just
will come
wondering
true.
the definition is from bench to bedside, right? What we need is from bedside or from, falling out to falling in. It needs to go the other way, and that's not changing. So they're doing all this lovely restructuring of the format of knowledge production, but very little of it challenging the fundamental values of knowledge transfer, translation.
But I love the way you're articulating it right now. If that goes into.
Give me the money and I'll write the paper.
And I'm not kidding. Get the money first. I mean,
There it is, the chicken and the egg problem.
Is write enough for us to get the money, and then you can write your paper.
That's sort of the way that I'm a researcher from Australia and qualitative researcher. Your work inspired me as a PhD student at the Busybodies paper that you wrote. Got it here.
And yeah, that's one thing that I struggle with. Like, I'm critiquing kind of the field that I'm in. I'm in the sports sciences, exercise sciences, but bringing in your, I guess, theoretical perspective on all this and struggling to get funding, but being parts of teams, and then when you get the funding, you write the papers that say what you want to say and make those critiques. But I was asking how you projects funded, and how I was interested in how you got funded for this. Isn't this falls research a funded project?
I am heading a CHR project right now, but it's on cognitive impairment. It's not on this. I folded in my own kind of tricky way, but the funding is for specifically on MCI, mild cognitive impairment, and kind of a critique of it as a category. Good question, though. I think every grant has a story of its own. We started with SHIRK because that is, as a sociologist, my kind of research home. And there was 5 team members, including Pia Contas, actually. So we had people from the humanities, anthropology, sociology, psychology, that wanted to look at mild cognitive impairment as part of a general development in what we were calling cognitive culture. CHR said that as of now, all health-related projects have to, SHIRK said all health-related projects have to go to CIHR. And even the interdisciplinary committee would not accept my justification. You have to write a 2-page letter to the interdisciplinary committee on SHIRK, trying to convince them to look at an application that doesn't fit their other committees. And if they don't like your justification, that's too bad, right? So they didn't really like my justification, even though it's an interdisciplinary team on an interdisciplinary project. And we have an interdisciplinary background. Apparently they didn't think that justified them looking at our proposal. So off to CHR we go, and had to rewrite everything, had to drop 2 members. One included Pia, unfortunately, because her part of the project was going to be a kind of looking at text, textuality, and art, and performance, and that didn't fit the CIHR project model. And so we had to become far more narrow and directed. Anne Martin Matthews had told me that more money was being pumped into aging research at CIHR, but the Social Dimensions of Aging Committee, social dimensions of aging, I emphasize, where everybody is applying. So we are now sociologists competing with everyone in medicine, and veterinarians, and dentists, and, the whole other scientific world, medical and biomedical world, on one committee. The year we got our grant, there's 2 competitions in CHR. The first competition gave out 4 grants. We came in 8th, and we're told, well, no one gets it first shot around anyway. Second time we did get it, and they only gave out 2 grants. We came in 2nd, so we were both 2nd and last for that one. So 6 grants across Canada, 3 francophone, 3 anglophone, on social dimensions of committee, where social dimensions of aging, where everybody from the social sciences, the sciences, and the humanities were all being directed. They wanted to do research on aging. In my competition, we got maybe $180,000 to $200,000, something like that. Number 1 got $1.5 million for studying mobility issues. Again, gait, posture, walkability, etc. So that also shows the priorities, CHR priorities as well. So 6 grants across Canada on social dimensions of aging. So you have to ask you, so maybe Anne is right that more money is going in, but look at the ways, you may have more experience.
Well, I
than
sit on that committee that you're talking about. Yeah, I just resigned. Because it's paltry what goes to the social event of the health side. It doesn't go. And I'm thinking about the split between the 2 agencies, like CHR and SHIRK. I had to phone them on the project that Sandra here is running for $2 million from SHIRK.
Yeah.
And I had to phone them and say, is DEF a social issue or is it a medical issue? Like, what do we do here? Oh my God, well, we're not sure. You know, and so like my
Can't
feeling on the
ask
matter is that it's become ridiculous in terms of the holistic approach all of us take to our work, and all of a sudden we can't do it anymore. And you were caught in that, exactly caught in that, and so were we. So we just lied and threw all our health stuff in there anyway,
And you
into
got,
the social part.
and you got funded.
Oh yeah, big bucks. They didn't notice.
What do you think, where do you think the big bucks for aging research is going today?
Pharmaceutical stuff.
Yeah, like what are the targets? What are the primary?
Dementia.
No.
Yeah, I think
At
dementia's
that lecture that
God's
Dr. Law
got-
gave, dementia actually, even though it's highly funded, is funded less than heart disease. And what was the other thing she said?
Oh, I'm not comparing it to heart disease. I'm talking about in the social sciences. And heart disease isn't getting that funded in the social sciences. In the social sciences, the biggest issue right now is around dementia, and having sat on both councils, that's what's been funded. Now, it's time to move on. That's what I think. And where I think we're going to go next is probably around the social network issue in the community and keeping people out of hospitals,
Right.
out of the hands of medical people, and taking care of themselves. That's what I think is going to happen. But I could be dead wrong. You never know what the government's going to do.
Makes sense. You know, hospitalization is the most expensive form
Oh,
of care.
and they're just going nuts over that. Like, I mean, oh my God, you know, older people are such a burden. It's just nonsense. But they're using it.
Yeah, there's that rhetoric too, like the tsunami effect.
Oh,
It was an interesting talk yesterday, the critical qualitative health research, where
Oh,
did you hear that, Debbie?
Brightman, yeah.
yeah.
And talking about the neoliberal discourse
Right.
around aging, responsible aging, being
Yeah.
responsible aging.
Yeah, that was her.
citizens.
Yeah.
Responsible aging, yeah.
Suzanne, did you have a comment?
I had a comment that I wanted to insert. It's related, but shifts things a little bit. So I just want to thank you so much. It was very provocative, and really enjoyed hearing your presentation. I think it's going to change how we all look at falls and how we all think about falls. And what I think I'm going to take away was that idea of how caregivers, and the gender differences, and how we treat people and support them or don't support them and encourage them. And I'm wondering maybe about some outcome research looking at those gender differences to see how people are able to continue and to fully recover. That might be interesting to look at. Yeah, and then I also just wanted to say that I think probably if you asked all of us, we probably all have a fall experience.
Sure.
And the talk about the pets reminded me of my tripping over my little miniature schnauzer that likes to be underfoot, right? Or unfortunately falling down the stairs with my baby in my arms and somehow managing to turn so that I fell backwards and didn't land on the baby, right? Like as a mom, you know, somehow this happens, right? So like we all have falls, like,
absolutely.
incredible stories. Yeah.
Oh, hey, that's mine. I love the bark.
Sarah Arbor, who is a sociologist in Britain. Sarah Arbor is one who's been writing about gender. There's quite a few papers on gender and fall.
Excuse me, thank you for a very engaging talk. My dentist sadly.
Medical model.
And you know, it goes along with other things as a last comment, which is when you think about women taking care of women, men taking care of men and women, you know, gender does get encapsulated in care relationships. And if women already are seen as kind of weak, needy, dependent, postmenopausal, and all the symbolic value that draws together, then caring for them becomes often very patronizing, you know, and controlling, and even coercive. It's time for your pill, you know, kind of thing, and regimented. And we forget about how gender fits into those kinds of things often too. Do you know Andre Smith at all? Andre is a sociologist in Victoria who's working on dementia as well in MCI, and he wrote a paper about how pill giving can be a form of care, not necessarily because the pill works, but because the person has a warmer relationship with the person giving the pills.
The original placebo effect, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So suddenly you're going, how do you feel now? It's time for your pill. Would you like some tea with that? Do you want to go for a walk after your medication? Like suddenly the medication becomes a way of drawing people together, even though it may not do, the medication itself may not do very much. And that's one of the arguments being made in some research about memory drugs, which is while they may not work or be that effective, it brings the carer and care recipient closer together, and they observe each other more.
And
you
almost
know?
all alternative medicine as well.
Yeah, it's so. Anyway, he's written some interesting stuff that enters into that intimate world of caring as well. I'm planning to organize a symposium at the Canadian Association of Gerontology conference in Halifax called Dementia's Body, which is the way in which dementia research has moved to biomarkers and away from behavioral and intimate kinds of observations, you know, the whole amyloid revolution and all that kind of stuff. So Andre may be giving a paper on that, and the team we have at Trent with my colleagues, hopefully we'll get to be a team for once. They're in public, maybe have T-shirts or something, you know.
But you know, usually resident-to-resident abuse is the behavioral outcome of all of what you're talking to. And I'm just thinking about that. That's murder. We're making older people into murderers, murdering other older people. And I think, how can we ignore that behavior?
I know.
And so your whole panel, I'll be there. Anyway, I join me in thanking you. You just gave us so much to think about. I really appreciate it. You're always so fascinating. So
Wow.
thank you very much. You probably have 10 of these, so you'll have a son.
It depends.
It's your month.
Yay! Thank you. Thank you. That's very nice.
Well, thank you.
It's great because I thought you did such a big deal, but I didn't get a mug.